Hello fellow wizards, this is Craddock, and I'm super excited today to bring you this Monolithial Hydra build. It's super tanky, which is really nice. It lets you engage elites, and it's a elite hunting build because we're using the Firebird set. We're also using Endless Walk as another one of our main damage multipliers, and you basically, the entire point of the build is to buff the Hydra, get a ton of damage from the Hydras. So we're also using Audacity, Trapped, Taeguk, Pain Enhancer. A lot of these things are close range, so it's a very close range build. You're going to want to be casting your Hydras very close to where you are and trying to stand in those Oculus rings. So anyway, let's this map right here was, I pulled together 5 elite packs, which is what you're going to look for when you're progressing, because they give a lot of progress. And this is a Greater Rift 89. I'm pretty sure this build will be Greater Rift 90 capable, which is super cool. So let's go ahead and go to town, and I'll talk some more. So where does this build stand? When you consider the Monald heal nerf that affects both Electrocute and Arcane Torrent builds, I think this build will be clearing higher than Electrocute builds in the upcoming patch, but it will be still 1 or 2, maybe 2 GRs lower than the Arcane Torrent can clear. So that's just something to think about when you choose this build. I like the playstyle of this build. It's very different in that you're not dealing the damage, your Hydras are, so it's more focused on maintaining buffs and positioning and making sure that you're staying alive, these sort of things. So one of the first things you need to understand about this build, since most of our damage is coming from the Hydra, is how the Hydra benefits from attack speed. The more attack speed you have, the more damage the Hydra will deal. This component of the Hydra's damage is snapshot into the Hydra when you cast it. That means before you cast it, you should make sure you have high pain enhancer stacks, high attack speed. That way when you cast it, the Hydra will deal more damage. Hydra also benefits from attack speed in another way. The Hydra's casting rate, the rate at which the Hydra attacks, will increase as you increase your attack speed. Now there are specific Hydra breakpoints which you need to look at and all that sort of thing. This build sits at the second breakpoint from the top, so 1 breakpoint down, which is fairly good for most of the Rift. With Pain Enhancer stacks, you can hit that top or near that top breakpoint, which is very good. There are a lot of damage bonuses and damage multipliers in this build you have to watch out for when you go to snapshot your Hydra. Something else that does require a snapshot in regards to Hydra damage is the Taeguk gem. Taeguk gives you roughly 50%, maybe more, additive damage, which is great, but it requires a snapshot. So as you cast, you're going to want to cast your Hydra when it has peak at 10 stacks, and continue channeling in between casting your Hydra. Now, another thing that is snapshot into this build is Unwavering Will. It's also additive damage, so you're going to want to wait at least 1.5 seconds before trying to cast your Hydras when at max Taeguk stacks. Now, there are other multipliers in this build. We got the Trap Gem, we also have the Audacity, and these are both close range requirements, so you're going to want to try and keep your Hydras up close. You can be 10-15 yards away from the Hydra if you're standing in an Oculus ring and you're surrounded by enemies. That is still considered really good position. If an Oculus spawns way out in the boonies, you may want to consider just staying close to get the damage bonus from Audacity instead. The other part of the build is the Endless Walk set. When you're standing still, you're going to be at your max damage. That's why the build is so tanky in the first place, because we're not going to be moving or trying to move around a lot. we're going to be standing still. We want to fit a lot of damage reduction in. For defense and damage reduction, we're slotting the Firebird 6-piece, so we want to ignite our elite. That'll give us 60% damage reduction. We're also using the Halo Ancient Parthen combo, so the more density around, you'll get more damage reduction. We're using Crystallize for the extra armor boost, which is very nice. And there are also a couple of skills we use for defense here. We're using Safe Passage, so every time you cast Teleport to move around, you'll get a 5-second, 25% damage reduction buff. Anytime you channel, you're going to be using Flame Ward. Flame Ward gives damage reduction, 15% at a minimum, and it ramps up to 25, which is huge and pretty big. On that note, with Teleport, we're using Illusionist for mobility, so when you take damage, you can just teleport again, continue getting that damage reduction, maintain that level of damage reduction. We're also using Mantle of Channeling in this build, so we will be gaining 25% damage reduction from that item anytime we're channeling, and we're channeling all the time, so there you go. We're also using Orb of Infinite Depth for the 60% damage reduction. So you're going to want to make sure you're hitting enemies with Explosive Blast when you're in density, as you move throughout the rift, basically all the time. Try and keep this up. The other passive we're using for defense is Unwavering Will. So anytime you're standing still, you're also going to gain that 20% armor, 20% resistance. Just makes it that much easier to tank those elites. Kind of skipped over it, but the skills we're using to ignite elites in this build are Explosive Blast. We have the Magic Weapon Ignite. Since we're using Arcane Torrent, it's a pretty high skill proc coefficient, so it shouldn't take long to get stacks on an enemy to get this portion of the burning buff. And then you've got Arcane Torrent Flame Ward, so those three make it pretty easy to ignite elites. Along the lines of buffing the Hydra, we're using the Tasker and Theo in this build. We'll increase the attack speed of our pets by up to 50%, which is great for hitting those breakpoints on Hydra. This item does not increase the damage of your Hydra, only the cast rate of your Hydra. Just something to note. And we're also using Serpent Sparker, obviously, to get the maximum number of Hydras we can. The more Hydras we have, the more Manald heal procs, and so on and so forth. Note here the Hydra has 3 heads, 1, 2, 3. Each head can individually proc paralysis, and each head will only deal, when it does proc paralysis, will only deal Manald heal damage once. So those are important things to note. Let's move on now to affixes. We're going to be wanting to gear with a lot of attack speed to hit those breakpoints. The attack speed you're going to want to be shooting for is 2.06 or 2.07, somewhere in there. That would mean max rolls on your gloves, both of your rings, and even your amulet you're going to want attack speed on, and also your weapon. You're going to want to strive for max attack speed on all of these items, though if you happen to have lower roll on your amulet, since that's very hard to get, I'd say it's fine if you get a 5% amulet. You can just roll with that, and your pain enhancer, as long as you have one enemy within 20 yards, will make up the gap for hitting the required breakpoint at that point. On that note, if you do have, I think it's like up to 14 enemies bleeding, you get bumped up to like pretty much the highest feasible Hydra, Non-Archon Hydra breakpoint, which is 3.33, I think, pet APS. Anyway, just know that if you have like 14 enemies bleeding, you'll probably get to that breakpoint, which is very nice. You can visually see the Hydras attack faster too. It's pretty encouraging when it happens. But yeah, for recovery in this build, we're using a lot of life on hit. So you're going to want to make sure, see I've got 50,000 here, so you're going to make sure you got it on weapon, bracer, also on your helmet, I prefer the helmet. You could roll Vitality here if you want more toughness, but I just prefer the recovery. For damage stats, you're going to want to be putting crit and crit hit damage everywhere possible. So gloves, both your rings, try and find crit hit damage. And then you want crit on your bracer, crit on your helmet, crit on your offhand, and crit hit damage on your amulet. For defensive affixes, this build rolls a lot of life percent, so you're going to want life percent on your belt, preferably with a secondary resist on this item, but I didn't get that, so here again, you're going to want life percent on your shoulders for sure. This shoulder isn't perfect. I would prefer to see armor instead of resist with a secondary resistance, but this is a pretty good item still. We're going to want to see all resist on your boots with armor. You're going to want armor on your pants for sure. And you're going to want, for your chest piece, the third defensive affix, you're going to want to look for elite damage reduction, which would be very good for this build. I have life percent here. You could put armor here as well. Life and armor are about the same for this build. Elite damage reduction, I still think would be the best, so look for that. Also make sure you're getting secondary resistances wherever possible. I opted to put Vite gems in my pants in this build. Also make sure you have an amethyst in your helmet. That's because I went for the life on hit on your helmet. If you roll Vite on your helmet, I would just put topazes here. Resource in the build is managed mostly by the Hydras binding belt. Reduces arcane power cost. You want to get as close as you can to 65% on this. I'd say anything less than 60 is probably not worth slotting. You're going to want arcane power on crit on your source. These two things are mandatory. You want a max roll of 4. I do not know, I have not tested if 3 works, but you definitely want a max roll 4 here anyways, so look for that. The huge benefit here is you can always ensure you're able to cast your Taeguk, spam your Explosive Blast, and recast your Hydras whenever you need to and reposition them at will, which is a huge thing for this build. So there is one other thing to mention. I happen to roll a pretty good Tasker and Theo here, but in a perfect world, what you would want to do is cube this item. So you put this in the cube, and then you wear the Mantle of Channeling, because it's much easier to find a Mantle of Channeling that is perfect than a Tasker and Theo that is perfect. So that's just something to keep in mind. You roll like this, and then I don't have one in my stash, but you replace your shoulder. So that's about it for the main guide. I'll go into a few swaps right now that I was testing and sort of worked but didn't completely work. One swap you could do is you could roll with the Witching Hour for the extra attack speed and crit hit damage. And this is hard to manage because resource is really hard to come by when you lose the Herc brushes. But you can manage it. I mean, if you roll with resource on your shoulder, and then you put a topaz in your helmet, like that, you would be able to sort of manage it in high density with at least 4 or 5 mobs around you. You can keep up all of your buffs and keep your Hydra buffed and still manage it. Thing is these rifts aren't perfect. It's very random. It's very frustrating when you start failing because your build isn't complete, and that's how I felt about the Witching Hour here. The attack speed here is pretty nice. I mean, it does bump you up a little bit, but overall it's not going to be so much considering you already have attack speed on your amulet. Another potential swap that you can do is instead of Unwavering Will, you could opt for Elemental Exposure, and you would run with Calamity to proc your arcane bonus and make sure you have cold damage on your weapon. Just make sure you have all 4 elements, and that boosts you up an extra 10% from the Unwavering Will, which theoretically would let you clear a little bit higher. It does more damage, but in the end I felt that this setup was not as good because of so much of the damage reduction lost when you make that swap. The other passive that you should consider when doing like lower clears or just trying to do gem ups for whatever reason, you can opt for Unstable Anomaly. It's still a great passive to have in this build because you get that double revive, and if one procs, you can let the other reset, and then you just stay alive longer, and that's a good benefit there. When you're progressing with this build, something you're going to want to look out for is certain monster affixes aren't good to encounter. I found that Frozen was by far the worst affix to encounter because it forces you to reposition out of position. And then you've also got Illusionist. It's pretty hard to deal with. Shielding is really bad affix to encounter. Juggernaut, Nightmarish, anything that would force you to drop Teguk stacks, kind of bad. So those are the ones you want to avoid. As to which follower you should pick, I go with the Templar for the increased regen from the Inspire rune. You could opt for the Enchantress. I would only go with Enchantress if you need that extra attack speed to meet the necessary breakpoint. Otherwise, I would just go with the Templar because his regen, his healing is so much better. Another quick gameplay tip is, for whatever reason, if you're low on your Orb of Depth stacks, if those are down for whatever reason, you're probably lost a lot of defense. And if you're in an area of the map where your Ancient Parthens wouldn't be able to benefit, if there aren't a lot of enemies around you, and you're trying to move between elite packs typically, sometimes you'll have maps with like spearmen or ranged mobs that are chunking missiles at you, and my tip is just stand and channel. You gain so much toughness when you're channeling that if you're trying to move to another area, you can just tap it even, right before you get hit with the missile, and that'll just give you so much damage reduction to keep you alive and not either proc or die in that time. You can also use this tactic, tapping, to, every 1 second or so, to keep up your Teguk and maintain your resource, since you will drop resource on single target. Rift Guardians, this is good especially since you might not be regenerating enough arcane power. That's about all I have on this build. As always, thank you for watching. I'll be rolling the Creator Rift 88 clear that I did after this, and I guess have fun with your Hydra.